probably know, Ezequiel is Basque research professor at the University of the Basque Country for 2 or 3 years. He was reader in evolutionary and adaptive systems, co-director of the evolutionary and adaptive systems master program, and member of the Center for Computational Neuroscience and Robotics at the University of Sussex, where now is visiting professor. He is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Enactivism. Ezequiel is very grateful for his acceptance to come here, and I'm personally very delighted with him to have been here. So I think.
Thank you, Manuel, and thanks to Dr. Koch and the organizers of this workshop for inviting me here. I've heard it said a couple of times that I'm supposed to give something like an overview, an integration of ideas that have been discussed in the workshop. You may be disappointed because I'm not so sure I have such an overview, but I think we may be able to then instead run through some themes that perhaps have not been brought to the surface, and yet I believe they have been underlying several of the discussions we had during these last 2 days. So the first thing I should say is explain a little bit this title. I'm not so sure how many of you know that Francisco Varela in the 1970s, he wrote a paper called Not One, Not Two. That's in 1976, that's Francisco Varela in his 20s. And in this paper he was he was looking at different kinds of dichotomies. Just, like man and matter, action and intention. It's many dichotomies, and try to see whether there was a particular pattern to the relation between the ways we speak about these terms. So he was doing a bit of dialectic exercise, and I thought it was interesting and inspiring. And in a way, this is what I take to be the topic of this workshop. To understand interaction, we have to understand a coupling, we have to understand dynamics, but we have to understand what is interacting and what is the relation between these two domains of discourse. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, because the background is that implicitly, you may come from all different areas, from robotics, from psychology, philosophy, neuroscience. Implicitly, you have already an idea of what is your position with respect to how what we might call the system and the interactions and the relations relate to each other. I repeat that. The system would constitute the unity that you're interested in, a robot, an agent, an animal, and how it relates to the world. Implicitly, we all have a way of saying what is the underlying ontology between those two domains of discourse. And this is one of the things that Francisco Varela was looking at as well. So, what was I talking about just now? So, for instance, you may recognize there the internal structure of one of Ray Walter's robots. We're looking at mechanisms, we're looking at cogs and gears, wheels, cables. And this is one domain in which we study systems. And then there's the other domain in which, there's this other domain, which is the domain of behaviour, where we look at that system, at that unity, in relation to its world. And we can find this in different walks of life. We say, look at the car engine, and look at the car. Look at the liver, and look at the things that might ruin your liver. Now, the thing is like this. We already may have an idea that, of course, there are relations between the behaviors and, if you like, the components of this constitutive domain, the domain of what the thing is, in relation to what the thing does. Now, it's interesting to realize that some people think that there is no way of deducing one thing from the other. That you cannot just say, oh, just because I see this behavior, there must be therefore this mechanism. Or just because I see this mechanism, there must be therefore doing this. And there are several examples in which this way of thinking is proven to be quite misleading. So for instance, Randy was mentioning the other day over lunch the work that Thomas did and Eduardo, where they evolved a neural network controller that put in two different bodies could perform two different tasks that were very radically different. So there is something to do with there's something that needs to be said about there is not enough information, if you want to use it in a totally non-technical sense, about what one domain does and what the other domain should be like. So I want to put that as the general broad question, because the rest of the talk is going to be going through some of the ideas of the inactive approach. And the take-home message is going to be that the inactive approach, in a way, is overcoming certain distinctions that were first introduced as very hard distinctions, especially in the theory of autopoiesis. So the inactive approach is very much based on the concept of autopoiesis, but in a way it's moving on. And I want maybe this to be the message of this talk. I mean, in what direction this is moving, from its origins. So you may look into the world, you may look at other people, artifacts, and you notice that these unities in which you're observing relate to each other in certain ways. And of course, you may look inside one of these units of action, behavior, or relations, and there may be a very complex, world inside the processes, physical processes, chemical processes, whatever, what have you. The question is, how do this kind of thing relates to this kind of thing? For functionalism, these boundaries are merely ascription. They're attributions that are and yet the relation at the level of unities is essentially the same as the relationship at the level of mechanisms. There is essentially a free passage through the boundaries. We care, for instance, and this is why I think it's problematic with functionalism, that we don't have a conceptual hygiene to say, to rule out expressions such as this neuron made a decision, totally, transversing the personal, subpersonal reality as if nothing really mattered. Now, for what I would call the traditional autopoietic theory, these boundaries are rather hard. There is one domain of discourse, which is the domain of constitution, the processes that make up the living system, and another domain of discourse, which is relational. And people like Maturana say this very explicitly. They say these domains are non-intersecting. Now, of course, we have to realize what he could mean by this. Because one thing that we could accept, he comes from systemic systems theory background, one thing that we could accept is that these domains may well be irreducible to each other, in the sense that it isn't what I said at the beginning. Just knowing what goes on here does not allow you to get a full determination of what goes on there, and the other way around. Yes?
Would it possible for you if there was some light in the room? Or
yes, that's up to you. I mean, this, yeah.
No, it's very hard to dark.
Yes, it's dark.
Go ahead, please.
Tienes que avisar con otro día. Apparently they have to activate the switch in order for that to work. In a control room or something.
Okay. Shall I go on until So, I want to say that, for instance, if you have read Maturana and Varela, they sometimes use this very problematic analogy when they want to explain what goes on at the level of neural activation when you're performing a particular task. And they say it's very much like you're inside a submarine, where you're reading all these sensors and all of this, and then you're activating levers, and you're just looking for these correlations between all these numbers and so on, but you have no idea that what's actually happened is that you're navigating around an iceberg or something. And I think it's what, you know, what is telling about this phrase non-intersecting. It means there is no connection. The only connection that exists between these two domains is one of structural coupling, of co-adaptation. That is to say, as long as the system sustains its organization and relates to the world in such a way that this organization is not broken, you know, there is a relation of adaptation to the world. Whenever this does not obtain, well, the system will have died at that point. So it's a very dualistic perspective when you think about it, because it's like you have an inner domain, the domain of chemical interactions or electronics and or, you know, neurodynamics, and an outer domain, and they somehow travel together, very much like the body and the mind would travel together in the philosophy of Mereological, for instance, who said that he resolves the Cartesian, you know, split between mind and matter by saying, well, God somehow is coordinating these two things, so that when you decide to lift your arm, that goes in coordination with some physical processes that lifts your arm. So it is a very strange solution to this problem, and not very satisfactory. And yet this is there in Maturana's work, for instance. So what I will try to convince you, and show you know, maybe some examples, is that there are boundaries indeed, but these boundaries are not that clearly defined, that these boundaries are slightly permeable. And what happens is that there are relations at this level, at the level of unities, but that these relations are constantly being modulated and monitored by, you know, processes that have to do with the constitutive aspects of this entity. So this is going to be where we try to get, and for that I need to give you a story from the beginning. So first, a couple of comments about what we mean by an entity, an identity. This is something that usually we just don't care. We just say, like, well, you know, we have a system there, and we all agree. That's a computer, that is a robot, that's a camera, and we just agree conventionally. But what's interesting about the inactive approach, I believe, is that it's not accepting this at face value. So somehow, whatever I'm studying, if it's you know, bacteria, animals, humans, they have to let me know somehow in my empirical engagement with them. They have to let me know that they themselves are constituting themselves as an entity. So, in general, ideas of individuation have to do with how something becomes a particular, a thing in itself. You've got many processes of all kinds, and there are different forms of ideas of individuation. So there's substantialist ideas, something becomes what it is because of the substance in which it is formed of, hydromorphic, processual. I don't want to go into all of them, but what's interesting about many approaches to the question of identity is that they are essentialist. That is to say, what makes this thing what it is something to be found in the thing. Just looking at it, there will be a condition in which I can say, this is a living system because it is autopoietic, for instance. Whereas other approaches look at also at systems and processes, but they're interested in including the relational domain into the definition of identity. And these two people who are up there, this is Gilbert Simondon and Hans Jonas, two philosophers, very different kinds of philosophers, who in a way belong to this latter kind of philosophers of identity. What makes a thing is an existence. And what does mean? Well, for instance, he says, Hans Jonas says, only those entities are individuals, because being is their own doing, and thus in a sense their task. Interesting. It's something about what it is that is related to what it does. And similarly, from a totally different perspective, a process philosophy perspective, Simondon says, we will say that there is an individual where there is a process of real individuation, i.e. when significations appear. The individual is that by which and that in which significations appear. The individual is the being that appears when there is signification. Reciprocally, there is only signification when an individuated being appears. See how the two things, they are definitely not essentialists. They're just not saying, I can tell that this is a real individual just by looking at what's going on inside. They're not saying that we shouldn't look. Well, maybe this quotes, there's not much about it, but in the whole philosophy, they're actually also saying that we should look inside and see what the organization is like. But what makes it an individual is a form of existence. And existence means that this system is doing something for itself and in itself. So, that's a bit of a context. And the traditional autopoietic perspective is, if you like, the classical essentialist position, or maybe not that classical, but where individuality is based on the notion of autonomy, in which I'm going to explain autonomy in some detail in a minute. And in living systems, that means the organization of autopoiesis, a system that is organized in such a way that networks of processes of production and transformation of molecular reactions is such that the organization of the network is renewed, as these processes function in this relational way. And it's also external. It's me who, as a researcher, am saying that is autopoietic according to this definition, and that isn't. Enactivism, I would say, is moving in the existential direction. That because, and this is coming out in the rest of the talk, it establishes a link between autonomy and sense-making. Autonomy being the equivalent of the autopoietic idea, the organization of the unity, and sense-making being what this thing is doing in the world. And until very recently, the only thing that we had was the arrow going this way, from autonomy to sense-making. And we're going to go through that in a second. But the rest of the talk, the second half of the talk, actually showed that the arrow goes the other way too. That what we do is constantly modulating who we are and how we are constituted. So, what do we mean by autonomy? We mean an adaptive, operationally closed network of processes in precarious conditions, to be exemplified in a second. And by sense-making, it's the regulation of internal states and interactions with respect to consequences for your own viability. Doing things, changing things in the cabinet of the world, in the hope that that will help, sustain your own viability, avert risks, and so on. And this is a very left-wing approach. I had to emphasize, because we are deliberately subverting all this vocabulary with notions of autonomy and sense-making, and finding it right down to the beginning of life. Sorry, I had to. So let's go slowly and say, well, okay, let's say autonomy and sense-making. Let's go for the first part of the arrow. How does that work? Because I think it's worth trying to go carefully through this whole thing, because what we claim is that all those steps are operational. We're not we're not going through circular definitions that says, well, autonomy is behaving on your own behalf, and that's it. No, we try to go into this in operational systemic terms. So let's go, when we have this little diagram that we also see outside in the posters, means that we have a system that is autopoietic and is related to its environment. It's self-producing, self-constituting, and it also relates to the world. And a typical example, I also see this diagram outside the poster, is the living cell. By this, there's a network of processes such that they form a closed network, a closed topology of enabling relations, modulating each other, regulating each other. And this, the effect of this network, because you might find a network of processes anywhere at any time, and they just, the processes continue operating, and the next minute it might not be there. But this particular kind of organization, the requirement is that what happens as a consequence of the operation of these processes is that the whole thing is reconstituted, that the whole organization remains the same thanks to the operation of the process. So it's a self-sustaining network. And I will exemplify this idea of autonomy throughout the talk with this arrow that fits on itself. This is just a diagrammatic convention. Now, what I have here is therefore autonomy. And what I have here, you may recognize this caricature from Eric Mine's example of perceiving the softness of a sponge. I want this to exemplify sense-making in general. It's just, again, a convention, but it means making sense of your world. In this particular case, making sense of the softness of a sponge by just squeezing it. So there's an involvement of action, perception, something that is not exemplified. Maybe is that there's an affective element to it. Well, maybe his face. It's like, ooh, surprise, and so on. Now, in the late of the 1990s, Francisco Varela proposed that there may be a way to get from here to here. There may be a way in which, by the very nature of the autonomous organization, we can deduce that the system must relate to the world in this sense, in the sense in which things, events, or whatever matter to it. You know, that it can distinguish, for instance, between those things that are relevant or irrelevant, those things that are good or bad for its own continuation. No, I did it? Yeah, well. The question is, does this move work? It turns out that he definitely tried, and then there was another paper towards the end of his life with Andreas Weber, where they were very detailed about how this syllogism could work. But to my mind, the whole thing could not immediately work. And why is that? Well, let's try to look a bit more carefully into what this bit is about. So I will explain this idea of autonomy, which I mentioned a couple of times, and I promised you that it's operationally defined. Well, okay, I'm going to do it in the way that you see this operationally defined. Suppose you're in the lab, and you are a scientist, and you're observing different processes. You're observing the temperature of this, chemical bath, the pH of that, the distance to the moon, whatever it is that you're observing and you're choosing to observe. Each of these blobs here is something that you're observing. It's a reading of a variable, a condition, relations between objects, whatever it is that you're observing. You have blobs there as like, okay, that's the temperature, that's movement of a certain whatever. Now, as a scientist, you decide to manipulate this thing and see whether there is some order to your observations. And you may end up finding that, for instance, that when you tweak this process or intervene with it, there is an effect in somewhere else within your observations. Whenever that happens, I draw an arrow. If the arrows are very thin, you almost cannot see them. But, So, for instance, if I tweak this process, this has a consequence in that one. I'm going to say something even stronger. I'm going to say that if I remove this process, then this one stops, disappears, stops being interesting. Whatever it is that you're trying to look into these processes, whether it's you're looking at oscillations, the oscillations stop. You're looking at certain conditions being, above a certain threshold for a variable, that doesn't happen anymore. Whatever it is that you're interested in, that stops what I intervene and remove this thing. So, of course, normally, as I said, we define systems by convention, and you say, well, we draw a line around them, and we say, well, that's the system, that's my car, that's the computer, and we just agree because of convenience. Well, I propose that in some cases we can carry on observing, because we can start following these arrows and discover more connections between these processes. And we may discover a very peculiar relation between some of them. So, for instance, these ones in green have an interesting topological property, which is they all have arrows going out of them and arrows coming in. And together they form a closed network. So, one thing that is important is that I will add a condition now to our definition in a second, but this is an operationally closed network. Because for this process to exist, we have to find among all these enabling conditions another process in the network. And for this process to be in the network, additionally, it has to be an enabling condition for another process to be in the network. Of course, this does not mean that the whole thing is disconnected from the world. As you can see, there are arrows that go, outside this network and arrows that come in. What happens is that, for instance, this arrow comes in, but it's not part of this network because no arrow goes into this process. So the two conditions must obtain. Now, the additional condition is one that I call precariousness. And it will become clear why I think this is inevitable. You have to ask additionally that these processes would normally tend to run down, disappear, stop, if it wasn't for the fact that they are connected in this way in this network. Okay? So that is an autonomous system, an operationally closed system. And why insist on this aspect of precariousness? Well, the fact is that precariousness is not only inevitable, it's actually necessary for refinement. Look at. So I know that I always irritate philosophers when I say it's not only inevitable, it's also necessary. You cannot avoid it, but you actually need it, and the two things are different. So precariousness is a tendency in the process to run down and stop if left on its own under the same physical condition. And that means you cannot ascribe any permanent function or property to any of these processes. They're all sustained in an equilibrium that is bound to just eventually disappear. Now, why do I think it's interesting or relevant? Well, we'll see. For one hand, if you have the autopoietic theory or similar theories, related theories that try to define life in systemic terms, like, for instance, Rosen's MR systems, I believe that the solution, I believe that they may be describing something interesting about life, but they're not ruling out solutions that are essentially, permanent. A rock, if you interpret production as, well, I am here, if you interpret transformation as the identity transformation, well, that's a solution of these definitions. So a rock will be alive. It is precisely when you put precariousness in it, when you have to start running. You cannot stay on the spot. The systems will run down unless something happens. So, looking at this network again, and looking at this condition of precariousness, I think it will just drive us, it will take us into what's interesting and different in the current enactive approach from the traditional autopoiesis. So again, we have this network of relations, and here in black are the processes that belong together in the operationally closed system. It could be the processes of production of a living cell, for instance, or something else. Now, because these processes are precarious, there is immediately a temporality associated to what's going on here. The previous definition seemed too static. It's like, okay, as long as there is this topological relation, it works, and that's fine. But now, we realize that some of these processes have rhythms of their own. Others may have deadlines. It will just disappear unless you fit something in time into them. And others have counters and clocks and other things, So, the whole network is very much, escaping this precariousness by putting conditions into the timing of its own organization, not just its topology. Or rather, to say that in topology, these arrows are about also doing things in the right time. So, in a way, that means that you have all these conditions in a sort of metastable state, if you wanted to call it like this. This organization is there, but all of its component elements are trying to, they are putting it at risk by its very constitution. So this system must have something else to keep it from, a state that, the way I just described it, sounds not very robust. And this is the idea of adaptivity, which I'm going to now introduce and add to the whole set of ideas. So imagine for a second that you have that system and you have something that you can describe here as the domain of viability of that system. By that I mean states of within this domain of viability means that the network is closed. It has not been broken. The system is alive. But states outside this boundary, that means the system has stopped being operationally closed. And you can do that, you can define that by looking at these relations of processes. So for instance, if you have one of those timers, and the condition is you had to, feed certain, chemicals into this spot before this other thing happens, and you don't do it, the whole network just collapses, according to what I just said. So what may happen is that if there's a trend of states that are about to cross this boundary, well, if the crosses happens, essentially, systemically, the whole thing has become open and it's no longer a closed network. However, if, for instance, there were mechanisms in the system that were able to be sensitive to these tendencies of approaching the network of viability and do something about it, to respond to these tendencies, for instance, by activating certain regulatory processes, a cell that could open or close ion channels, for instance, to regulate osmotic pressure, and so on and so forth. If this happens, what you have is that the system not only is it autopoietic or autonomous, it's also adaptive. And again, there is a definition of adaptivity that you can even read because it's outside of it. Anyway, it's in the papers, but there is a way of saying operation what I just said about the crossing of the boundaries. Okay? Now, what's going on here? The problem is that if I were to use the condition of being a closed network or not, to generate sense-making, which is sense-making, which is what Varela wanted to do, sense-making being sensitive to graded changes in the world, things that may actually be good for you, better, or you should avoid. If you were just used to use that binary condition, that binary set theoretic condition, that is whether the system is closed or not, you cannot do it because essentially, if something is bad, it will only be manifested once the thing is broken, once the organization, the topology is broken. And that means the system is already dead. You will find out that you should have avoided that particular interaction, but just too late, just when you die. So there's something else that needs to be there. And I propose that this notion of adaptivity, whenever it happens, it can supplement that condition. So you have the system providing yourself with an objective condition, which is this system itself may die or may survive. It's a data that may be preserved or not. And the system itself having mechanisms which are going to be imperfect. They're not going to be perfect. We have adapted mechanisms, but not to every possible perturbation that might kill us. So, for instance, we are not sensitive to radiation, for instance. So, but this even imperfect mechanisms, if they can tell that the system should avoid a certain interaction before that interaction happens, they are adaptive. And therefore, they together help us resolve the problem that Varela had. Many of these things, and this is going to be a point that I'll mention in a minute, many of these control mechanisms are totally known. There's nothing mysterious about this. In biology, there's something called rate control, because it's interesting that in biology, feedback mechanisms, I mean, there are no negative signals as such in biology. What there are positive signals of different kinds. And there are different kinds of reactions to how you control an excess of a particular variable. So if you're very hot, you start sweating, and if you are a bit cold, you start shivering. And there's two different mechanisms are working like the reins of a horse, trying to pull a variable into a stable condition. And this happens in many cases, blood glucose, other things. And what's interesting is that these two opposing tendencies may involve typically different mechanisms. Different blobs in that network are doing the regulation, adaptive regulation. Different blobs in that network, one of them is put in this way, and the other is put in that way. There is no pre-established equilibrium point, but the whole thing self-organizes. And what's interesting is that I want you to consider what would happen if you let one of this block, continue to pull. Because we tend to think that in the organization of a living system, everything is harmonious, and every element, every process is contributing to the organization in a positive way. It's like you got the circularity that I told you about, and then maybe you could represent, every process is, interacting with others and so on, but each of them contributes positive to this circularity. They all helping each other, coordinating in such a way that they will eventually sustain your life. I want to show you a different picture because I believe that this is the one that leads to the static view of life. I want to show you a picture in which it's true, the effect of each process in the network is contributing to the sustenance of the organization. But if you were to leave them alone, they actually would try to diverge. If you let an organ, if you let any organ of your body have its way, it will kill you. And what happens is that the action of the other processes is preventing this from happening. So when you're pulling from one brain too much, it's the other brain that comes and says, "Whoa, no, stop, stop, stop." So this is a very different conception, even though the result is still a circle. It's an inherently and richly dynamic conception. We're never in a perfect equilibrium. We're always poised in, running to keep on the spot. And I keep thinking that this is a double negativity. You get the negativity of each of these individual processes, which is, if you let it run, it will kill you. And the negativity of the network that says, no, I will stop you before you kill us. So there's a double negativity, and as I said, people heard me say this, it's like life is a sort of frustrated suicide. Instead of continuing and harmoniously living there, you're just only keeping yourself from essentially dying by your own negativity. Now, this is, you may think this is totally crazy, it's not mad. But in fact, it can be modeled very well. For instance, this is a model of a homeostat, Ashby's homeostat. We have it also out there, a sort of self-regulating system. I'm not going to explain it and so on, but this one in particular is designed to be inherently unstable. So each variable will, they have this area of viability, so they have to, whenever they cross this boundary, there are plastic reorganizations, like a neural network that changes its inputs, its synapses. But it's impossible for any of these variables to stay there on the spot quiet. And yet the whole system, not always, you can see this, you can see it in the method here, but the whole system is quite robust. So, and this is a very simple model, and yet it shows that there can be global stability with internal instability, inherent internal instability. You could never really make it stable, and yet globally you can. So it's like having a constant transient in the system. So now, step back again and say, well, we were here, and we wanted to go from here to there. I propose that what happens is that you have to add adaptivity to now really naturalize sense making. And for those who are interested in resolving, being naturalistic about what the mind is, well, this slide explains it. This is the naturalization of cognition. Now, let's go back a little bit to now move on to the part where it seems that yes, we could. Let's say, well, it sounds a bit too crazy, but let's assume that you're right, and you can go from autonomy into sense making. You said something even crazy, which is you can go from sense making into autonomy. That surely must be wrong. You've been drinking too much. Now, let's take a look at what this could be. Again, let's look at the organization of this closed network. Imagine for a moment that something goes wrong in this network. So, for instance, First, I wanted to make a parenthetical, comment, which is that the closed organization could have itself embedded closed loops, so that there can be a topology of closed networks. And this is just to show that later there can be different kinds of autonomy, different levels of autonomy where this organization undertakes. So before we move on to actually I was jumping ahead. Let's define what we mean by behavior or by agency. Now, we did some work some time ago with Xavier and Marique on defining the concept of agency in the same style as I was defining autonomy, etc. So we identify we look at the usage of the term agency and identify what were the requirements for something to be called an agent. And we noticed that one element would be individuality. You know, we never call agents things that are diffuse and, you know, we kind of point to. We say, this is the agent, this is an agency. Even if you mean agency in a large sense, it could be the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, it has an individuality. Asymmetry, in the sense that agents do something in the world. Not all the time, but sometimes what they do is they're not simply coupled to the world, they do things in the world. And this is an asymmetry in this dynamic review of two things coupled. And normativity. The things that they do is actually, they are regulations. They're actually, you know, modulations of this coupling in such a way that something is sustained. Now, what we suggest is that if you've got this autopoietic system, this autonomous system, and you've got it such that it is adaptive, it can measure what's going on, what's going to happen, and avoid it, and so on, you will have an agent whenever you have a modulation of the coupling that, you know, that is enabled by the autonomous dynamics. So whenever, it could be like the opening or closing of an ion channel to you know, or pumping out sodium for a cell. Or it could be, you know, water is down there, mass is up here, gravity will not let it go, flow upwards, but let's change that relation and then drink the water. Okay? I'm modulating the coupling of the world, and that's what's the difference between behaving and being coupled to the environment. Being coupled to the environment is happening all the time, even when I'm not behaving. Even when someone punches me, it's not behavior, someone's punching me. You know, I just suffering that particular coupling. But behaving would be like avoiding the punch or punching back. Now, this is what is the key to behavior, and yet you would see like, well, that sounds too complicated. But we also done this model of bacterial hemotypes where with Matthew Eckler and Xavier, where we coupled an autocatalytic reaction, very much representing or modeling in a very simple way the closed network of metabolism, with a behavioral decision whether to, you know, to run or tumble on the spot. And then this coupling itself can model very, you know, qualitatively very nicely the empirical findings on metabolic dependent chemotaxis in bacteria. So, and this is what we mean by agency. We mean regulating the environmental regulations, environmental coupling, in this case by controlling the motor, depending on the state of the internal network of metabolism. Now, agency, of course, has many different manifestations, and we know that, for instance, agency involves in certain animals, involves mainly movement. But agency can also be not movement. Can be, you could still be doing something as an agent, not doing anything in particular, because that's the conditions where you you encounter yourself are the ones you want. And so here is a turtle sunbathing, and you go especially there to do nothing, because that's what you want. So you can submit to the dynamics of the world. You don't need to control absolutely everything. And agency may involve more complex forms of behavior, such as changing your environment, changing your world, acting, not just moving about and regulating the coupling, actually introducing changes in the environment. So the other element I wanted to mention is the idea of habit, because as I told you, this circularity of organization can obtain at different levels. I mean, people like Francisco Varela, how much are you doing with time? You don't even think this. Sorry. I'm just carrying on. 15? 15? Okay. There are other forms of close organization, and for instance, imagine that you've probably seen something like this: a path on the grass there. How is it formed? Well, people, when they see the path, they walk on the path, so it regulates, the walking behavior is regulated by the path. But it is the walking itself that just prevents the grass from regrowing. So it is the walking that makes the path, and the path that makes the walking. When this sort of circularity escapes just the internal constitution of the agent and it starts involving, aspects of the world, what we have is that we have behaviors that, in a way, introduce dispositions and changes both in the agent and in the world, so that this behavior will be very likely reenacted. It will happen again. So when that happens, that's called a habit. Of course, all behaviors leave some trace, but not all of them leave a trace that predisposes you to reenact the same behavior. So not everything is going to be habit. And a habit has a form of autonomy, and so on. Now, this is very sensitive and it goes very fast. Wait. Yeah. So look at this insect here. This is called the water boatman, but there are many insects that do exactly this, and I'm going to tell you. It's actually underwater, probably you cannot see very well here. And you can probably spot some tiny air bubbles there. So normally, if you have an air bubble and you take it underwater, eventually it will dissolve. But because these bubbles are trapped in the tiny hair of the abdomen, the plastrons, they are prevented physically from dissolving. So they're just being held by the hairs. And of course, air has oxygen. And this oxygen in the bubbles can be used by the insect for respiration. Of course, you say, well, yeah, that's not going to last. It's just going to be a few seconds. But what happens is that because of the difference in the partial pressures between the air and the water, oxygen actually flows into the bubbles. And these bubbles act as an artificial lung. They are an external lung that allows this insect to remain underwater, in some cases indefinitely. You can say for hours, days, and so on. Now imagine the following situation, because imagine that, and this is just a story, this is sort of some, just a sort of story. Imagine that this becomes a habit for the insect. Insects do this, explore underwater environment, find interesting new nutrients there that we're not used to consuming. That introduces changes in the metabolic pathways, activating pathways that were not necessarily active before, in such a way that the insect somehow is metabolism is more efficient and so forth. And in a way, the metabolic pathways that allow it to metabolize the food on the surface disappear. So what's going to happen now? Because this system was operationally closed, supposedly, to start. Now it started to expand its domain of behavior by going into the water. And it has lost something by gaining something. It has gained this larger domain of behavior, but it has lost the capability of metabolizing this food on the surface. So in a way, behavior has become a condition of the internal closure of metabolism. Not just necessary in terms of material input, that was already there, but organizationally necessary. So we go from, imagine the insect before going into the water, a perfectly closed operational system. Somehow that gets broken by going into the water, because now the insect has lost something, it cannot go back into the surface. But because it's behaving in time, that allows it to recover that closure through the behavior. In a way, it's as if you get this closed network here and something goes wrong. Imagine that link disappears. Well, it depends on what was going on here, of course, whether the system is going to die immediately or not, because this could be a deadline. And if the system is able, therefore, to act in the world, modify those other networks, in time for that to be reconstituted, the system will not disappear. And this could eventually, that could be an action, that could be stopped. Then again, you're in this condition of danger. And then maybe you end up deciding to do something else. And that puts you back. So there's a rhythm to life. And isn't that what we do? If you isolate a human being, it will just die. But you require all these constant interactions with, oxygen, food, water, and so on. So it seems that, on the one hand, the domain of viability can be enlarged by behavior. It can be made bigger, represented here by a larger set. But once you start navigating this set, your internal conditions may change. And because what was the connection here? There was a point.
Behavior increases the viability.
Yes, okay. So essentially, this example, I want to show you that you may survive if you behave. So this was something that hasn't been published yet. It was also done with Xavier and Matthew, where we have a cell, like a bacteria, like before, navigating the world. And when you navigate the world, you can go up a gradient of food. And this is shown here. So this is the food, the amount of food. And this is, if you like, a measure of health. How much, is your metabolism working or not? So imagine that you resolve these autocatalytic equations, and you find that there are, for some values of food, you have two stable conditions. One is you die, so you can't see it here, but you say this value goes down to 0, and this is a stable condition. And for some values of food, you end up at some point jumping to this other value, which is you grow to this level. So imagine if the level of food is 1.5, you grow up to this point. And most of the models in computational biology that look at protocells are very happy to show you this kind of diagrams. They say like, hey, look, our equations work very well because we show you that there are solutions that exist that are non-zero for metabolism, meaning the system can survive. And I say that's too much, that's overkill. Because if the system is able to behave, you can also survive in areas that are unstable. So this line that separates the stable solution from the two stable solutions. So if you're here, you normally would just drop down to 0. And if you're here, on this side of the line, you go up to this level. Suppose that this level is actually prohibited for some other reason, such as osmotic catastrophe or something like this. You grow too much and you will explode. Okay? So you say, well, if you ask a biochemist, you say, like, look, you got the unstable solutions here, then you got the zero death solution, and you got the stable life solution, but you cannot reach it because of this line cannot be crossed for some other reason. They will say, well, the system cannot live. Well, it cannot live if it stays there on the spot. But if it moves up and down this gradient, up and down the gradient of food, and you change these values, then it just can carry on being active, moving, crossing this boundary of, in unstable conditions. So if you're here, if you're down here, you will tend to go down to 0. Well, that works only if you stay on the spot, and if maybe you just cross it here to this point and you still start going up. Well, if you go up, you don't want to cross this line, so then you go back to here, and then you go back to here. And this is what we do, we just cross these boundaries back and forth. So this is a system that would normally be considered impossible. You couldn't be alive, but that's because we think that it cannot behave. So in this case, again, the closure of the autonomy depends on behavior in a strong sense. So it is as if we have relations of production, again, and relations of interactions. Again, this is, again, a divide that we obtain, even if there are circular relations, like metabolism and habits. We typically think that this is the arrow, that makes sense. But in fact, it may be possible that this arrow also makes sense, the one that goes this way. So it is agency that strongly enables the constitution of the system to sustain itself, to keep on being a constitution. So again, you have this expanded domain of viability now. The green area is the one that you care about now. You forgot about the one that you had when you were not behaving. And that can drift through interactions with the world. Now there are areas in the original domain of viability that you cannot longer visit, because you must be within the green area. And there are areas in the new domain of viability where you have maybe the original condition of having a strong internal self-constitution, and areas where no, the constitution exists only through behavior. Okay, this, I will have to skip this, although it's a way to say that this is not just a theoretical exercise. You can propose ideas of how this form of agency can also impact on how we look at early stage evolution in protocells and so on. I think I'm going to skip it because I don't know. There's a reference there, also what Matthew mentioned there. But this is in a way related to ideas that are very much in the kind of, maybe I was moving away from the things that you thought were relevant to this workshop, but in fact, many of you may notice this work by Dr. Antonero on when does a tool become a tool, when I'm interacting with a tool in such a way that is skillful. In a way, it's the same story. It's a story of incorporation. What the tool may be actually handled as an artifact that unskillfully, or it may be incorporated into a network of processes that sustain a particular habit, say, hammering nails. And these have very different dynamical signatures. You can do the 1/f noise analysis that we already heard about yesterday and so on, and it has different dynamical signatures. So this behavior, either through its consequences or through a specific material, instantiation such as tool, gets incorporated. Incorporated means precisely this. It becomes part of, if you like, the domain that seemed to be just the chemistry. And in a way, it's to say that habits become inscribed in the body. They can become written into the body. For instance, children in South Pacific islands, from very early age, they get experience in looking for things underwater, pearls or whatever. They have been they studied vision, underwater vision in these children, and they have perfect underwater vision. They can read a book underwater. Where from your own experience, you probably know that when you go underwater, you open your eyes, you see all blurred. Well, this is a case in which the habit is getting inscribed in the physiology. So, this inscription, of course, is most clear in the case of human beings for social interactions. And well, Hannah already spoken about the situations of co-regulation of the coupling leading to closure of co-regulation. Closure sometimes means it could be that even though you're not intending it, you're regulating the coupling in order to sustain interaction. So imagine you're talking to somebody and you're walking together, and you just walking at the same speed in order to carry on speaking. Then you enter a very loud park or a bar, and it's so noisy, and you carry on speaking that you get closer to each other without even thinking about it. You just get closer and start speaking very much closer than before. And normally you regulate this distance. Look, if I took a picture of you, this very regular the distance between you. There is a comfort zone, isn't it? That you're not very close together, and yet you're spread very, very, rather uniformly, and so on. So all these things are regulations that we do not necessarily consciously. That helps sustain a certain pattern of relations to others in interaction. So, of course, Hannah already mentioned this, but for instance, one thing that happens is that social norms can have this effect of becoming embodied, so to speak. So, social norms such as this get enacted. I'm going to find get enacted and get regulated normatively by our interactions with others. And without even having to think about it, when we sit at a table and everybody's doing something that you've never done before, you start looking around and it's like, oh, should I do the same? What should I do? Maybe I missed something before. Anyway, so that's the way. And when you do that, you're also enforcing social norms of others. And so again, this is just same as the previous talk. Essentially, we're not going to go back into it. But the point being that our social interactions very much end up changing, even our physiology. They don't change just our behavior, but they change our mental health and our, which genes become active, our neurobiology. There is this element of the relational domain that gets inscribed by this mechanism of drifting the conditions of possibility of my closure onto the behavioral domain. So this happens increasingly more and more studies of social inequality and their effects on cognitive development and so on and so forth, and on mental health. And I'm going to repeat something that some of you may have seen in Miriam's talk, because this is her point actually. Social interactions have, at the very least, two very interesting, distinct flavors. In some of them, for whatever reason, maybe because people are paying attention to you, like now you're looking at what I'm saying and so on, or because your body is treated in a certain way, you become very much aware of your own self. You become distinguished from this social interaction is just drawing a boundary and says, this is me. This is me. Your attention is just making me very much aware and it's distinguishing me from others. And in other conditions, your social interaction just allows you to flow and lose a little bit of yourself. And this is, again, something that at the level of the autonomy of the human self, again, another level of autonomy, seems to be part of the constitutive processes of this autonomy. And Miriam, we had this thing that we had a social self, a human self, that is, again, simplified as a self-sustaining identity, but it depends on processes of distinction where contribute to this, making this self rather big, or process of participation where this self is sometimes loosen up and you just, like in a big concert, you get lost in the community, in their collective level. And Miriam has related this to, the etiology of schizophrenia. Anyway, the view that I want to then give you is that once these two domains, the constitutional and the relational, become not confused, not open, and yet explanatorily and operationally intertwined, you get these arrows going up and down from, if you like, social institutions, habitats, social interaction, persons, even physiology. And that each of these levels has a level of autonomy in itself. Okay, so to close then the point of what I've been saying is to go backward to this thing I showed before. There are boundaries. The boundaries are not dissolved, but they are superseded in the sense that they are not these non-intersecting boundaries. There are borders, and there are connections between what happens at this level and what happens at this level. And these connections are the regulations and the incorporations. So that dependencies, this depends on this, but this also depends on that, in a strong sense. This is just to show you that, if you compare the open boundary version, the autopoietic version, and the inactive version, the really nice one is this one. But seriously, we're trying to define concepts of identity, autonomy, sense-making, agency, behavior, social interaction, incorporation, and something we didn't speak about, but it's taking experience seriously. But I have not said anything about it yet. And yet, I believe that functionalism is unable to do any of this, that autopoiesis helps identify and generate a concept of identity and autonomy, like in the case of autopoiesis, but fails to give us definition of behavior, sense-making, interaction, and so forth. And what we try to do is to try to get to this with the same style of work that was introduced in the original autopoietic literature. So, the point then is that when we look at process identification, it's always an unfinished, ongoing process. It's precarious and it's keeping itself going through its behavior in the world. There is, as I said, also a negativity to these processes, and that's what makes it move. If it doesn't move, if it was only positive, in the sense that everything just contributes positively, it will just stay there, and it could be just, totally passive. But there is a negativity because things have their own conditions of negation. The processes in time tend to produce the effect that we don't want. So they have to be stopped somehow. So this negativity of the process itself and negativity of stopping that process. There are, as I said, multiple forms of closure at the behavioral and constitutive levels. And interestingly, the whole thing is that although there is a relation between the system and its world, the relation is in a way also codifying the system and the world. It's an ontology where relations are not secondary to identity. Identity becomes, if you like, codependent on relations. And the view is that there's a sense-making, there's a non-neutrality of interactions with the world, and this sense-making, I want to propose, is an aspect of the definition of life, not something that happens afterwards, as myself included, believed a couple of years ago. So you are what you do, and you are because you do. So, as I repeat, it's an anti-essentialist position, it's an existential position. Let's stop there, thank you.
Okay, any questions?
Thank you for that. I think that you are redefining many of the words, like autonomy, like identity. Why do you do that instead of inventing new words, like Di Paolo, for example?
So, in which, okay, I could give you different answers to that, but we have to look at maybe specific situations. I mean, so some words are not quite redefined, but they are, if you like, grounded. I would call it grounded in the sense of